Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. Today, we're going to take a look at a subject that could be considered as American as apple pie.
George Bush. George Bush. George Bush. Who is a terrorist? Who is a terrorist? Who is a terrorist? Arrest him now, right now. Send him back. Send him to the nearest prison cell right now. That's your job. RCMP, do your job. Pamela, say hi to George for me.
Fixing the dust. You don't negotiate with terrorists.
That's right.
And that subject is protest. From day one, America has been a place of one protest after another, and it never seems to end, and it never will end. Need to take a moment to look at the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or, and this is the part that's important for us today, is the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so they knew there would be protests, and they gave license to it as long as it was peaceable. First, we need to take a moment to look at the Indian Massacre of 1622. It's very near the beginning of everything in our country. Braves of the Powhatan came unarmed into our houses with deer, turkeys, fish, fruits, and other provisions to sell us. The Powhatan killed all of the English settlers they found, including men, women, and children of all ages. The Powhatan Confederacy, in a coordinated attack of surprise attacks, killed 347 people, a quarter of the population of that small Virginia colony. The Pequot War. The Pequot War was an armed conflict that took place between 1636 and 1638 in New England between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of the colonists of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies and their allies from the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes. The war concluded with a decisive defeat of the Pequots. At the end, about 700 Pequots had been killed or taken into captivity. Hundreds of prisoners were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Other survivors were dispersed as captives to the victorious tribes. King Philip's War, sometimes called the First Indian War, Metacom's War, or Metacomet's War, an armed conflict in 1675-1678 between Indian inhabitants of New England and New England colonists and their Indian allies. It was named for Metacomet, the Wampanoag chief who adopted the name Philip because of the friendly relations between his father, Massasoit. The war continued until the signing of the Treaty of Casco Bay in April of 1678. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's rebellion took place 1676-77 by Virginia settlers led by Nathaniel Bacon against the rule of Governor William Berkeley. His grievances stemmed from Berkeley's dismissive policy to the political challenges of its western frontier, leaving Bacon out of his inner circle and refusing Bacon to take part in the fur trading with Native Americans. And Berkeley refused Bacon a military commission that would allow him to fight and attack Native Americans at his own discretion. Attacks by the Dogue people incited the popular uprising against Berkeley for failing to address the demands of the colonists regarding the safety of the frontier. The Dogue people both traded and made war on the Virginia frontier. The Dogue tribe is one that disappeared 100%, although some of their language continued in other tribes. Leisler's Rebellion. Leisler's Rebellion was an uprising in the 17th century colonial New York in which German-American merchant and militia captain Jacob Leisler seized control of the colony's south and ruled it from 1689 to 1691. The uprising took place in the aftermath of Britain's Glorious Revolution. Remember, that's the one where no blood was shed. And the 1689 Boston Revolt in the Dominion of New England, which had included New York. The rebellion reflected colonial resentment against the policies of deposed King James II. Other colonial rebellions. There were a lot of them that took place, one after the other, and I won't read all of these, but you see they were going one after the other: 1715, 1713, 1734, 37, 39, 41, 42, 46, 47. A rebellious people. The Albany Congress. The Albany Congress in July of 1754, also known as the Albany Convention of 1754, was a meeting of representatives sent by the legislatures of 7 of the 13 British colonies to discuss better relations with the American Indian tribes and common defensive measures against the French threats from Canada. Benjamin Franklin was the one who organized it. The Albany Plan called for a unified level of colonial government. The delegates voted approval of a plan that called for the union of 11 colonies with a president appointed by the British Crown. The colonies' various legislatures rejected the plan, however, but many of the elements of the plan were later the basis for the Articles of Confederation. Pontiac's War. Pontiac's War, also known as Pontiac's Conspiracy or Rebellion, was launched by 1763 by a loose confederation of American Indian tribes, primarily from the Great Lakes region, the Illinois country, and the Ohio country, who were dissatisfied with British policies in the Great Lakes region following the French and Indian War, 1754 to 63. Warriors from numerous tribes joined the uprising in an effort to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. The war is named after Odawa leader Pontiac, the most prominent of the many Indian leaders in the conflict. Stamp Act of 1765, a real turning point in the history of the United States. The Stamp Act of 1765 was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain which imposed a direct tax on the British colonies in America and required that many printed materials in the colony be produced on stamped paper produced in London carrying an embossed revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies, and it had to be paid in British currency, not in colonial paper money, which was pretty worthless. The Stamp Act was very unpopular among colonists. A majority considered it a violation of their rights as Englishmen to be taxed without their consent that only the colonial legislatures could grant. Their slogan was, "No taxation without representation." Colonial assemblies sent petitions and protests, and the Stamp Act Congress held in New York City was the first significant joint colonial response to any British measure when it petitioned Parliament and the King. Then later comes the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, in which British soldiers shot and killed several people while being harassed by a mob, in Boston. It was heavily publicized by leading patriots such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. British troops had been stationed in the province of Massachusetts since 1768 in order to support Crown-appointed officials and to enforce the unpopular parliamentary legislation. Amid tense relations between the civilians and the soldiers, a mob formed around a British sentry and verbally abused him. He was eventually supported by 7 additional soldiers led by Captain Thomas Preston, who were hit by clubs, stones, and snowballs. The snowballs are important. This is in March, and it's winter in Boston. Eventually, one soldier fired, prompting the others to fire without an order by Preston. The gunfire instantly killed 3 people and wounded 8 others, 2 of whom later died of their wounds. Importantly, Crispus Attucks, a black man, was one who died. He was mixed Indian and black. Propaganda. This is the painting that was so important. It's called the Bloody Massacre, perpetrated in King Street March 5th. This is the name of it, the title. Revere copied most of his famous image from that of another engraver, Henry Pelham. So Paul Revere gets the credit, but it wasn't his. He copied it from somebody else. The engraving distorts the scene by showing the Boston crowds as innocent and defenseless, while the British soldiers are depicted as deliberate murderers. Additional details were also distorted, including the blue sky, which was odd because the event occurred about 9 o'clock at night, and a sign reading Butcher's Hall on the Customs House, and no such sign was present. In creating black and white engravings and leaving it up to other artists to color in the scenes, engravers avoided highlighting a key detail of the events, the race of one of the 5 victims, Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent, is considered by many historians to have been the first casualty of the Boston Massacre. More than 80 years later, in the 1850s, the abolitionists pushed Attucks to the forefront of depictions of the Boston Massacre. Pure propaganda. The Boston Tea Party, political and mercantile protest by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts, December of 1773. The target was the Tea Act of May 10, 1773, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea from China in American colonies without paying taxes, apart from those imposed by the Townshend Acts. American patriots strongly opposed the taxes in the Townshend Act as a violation of their rights. Demonstrators, some disguised as Native Americans, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the East India Company, and it was worth millions of dollars. They boarded the ships and threw the chests of tea into the Boston harbor. The British government responded harshly, and the episode escalated after another couple of years into the American Revolution. The Tea Party became an iconic event of American history, and since then other political movements, protests such as the Tea Party movement of a few years ago, have referred to themselves as historical successors to the Boston protest of 1773. And then our own American Revolution. The American Revolution was in fact a protest, a colonial revolt which occurred between 1765 and 1783. The American patriots in the 13 colonies defeated the British in the American Revolutionary War with the assistance of France, winning the independence from Great Britain, and thus the U.S. was established. The American colonials proclaimed no taxation without representation, and it started with the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. They had no representatives in British Parliament, and so rejected Parliament's authority to tax them. Makes one wonder what would have happened if there had actually been representation allowed from the colonies. Protests escalated with the Boston Massacre, the burning of the Gaspé in Rhode Island in 1772, and the Boston Tea Party. The British closed Boston Harbor and enacted a set of punitive laws which effectively rescinded Massachusetts Bay's self-government. The other colonies rallied behind Massachusetts, and American patriot leaders set up their own government in late 1774 at the Continental Congress to coordinate their resistance to Britain. Other colonists retained their allegiance to the Crown and were known as Loyalists or Tories. Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was an armed uprising in western Massachusetts in opposition to a debt crisis among the citizenry and the state government's increased efforts to collect taxes both on individuals and their trades. The fight took place mostly in and around Springfield in 1786, 1787. Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays led 4,000 rebels in a protest against economic and civil rights injustices. Shays saw action previously in the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and battles of Saratoga, and he had been wounded in action, so he was a legitimate war hero. In 1787, the Shays rebels marched on the Federal Armory in Springfield in an unsuccessful attempt to seize its weaponry and overthrow the government. The federal government found itself unable to finance troops to put down the rebellion, and was consequently put down by the Massachusetts state militia and privately funded local militia. Widely held view was that the Articles of Confederation needed to be reformed as the country's governing document, and the events of the rebellion served as the catalyst for the Constitutional Convention and the creation of a new government. What it demonstrated was if you could not put down a rebellion in one of the states as a government, you were not effective. And so they needed to find a new way to be effective. And that eventually leads to our United States Constitution that we live under today. The Whiskey Rebellion, also known as the Whiskey Insurrection, was a tax protest of the United States beginning in 1791 and ending in 1794. It was under George Washington as president. The so-called whiskey tax was the first tax imposed on a domestic product by the newly formed federal government. Beer was difficult to transport and spoiled more easily than rum and whiskey. Rum distillation in the United States had been disrupted during the American War of Independence, and whiskey distribution and consumption increased after the Revolutionary War. The whiskey tax became law in 1791 and was intended to generate revenue for the war debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. The tax applied to all distilled spirits, but consumption of American whiskey was rapidly expanding in the late 18th century, so the excise tax became known as the whiskey tax. Farmers in the western frontier were accustomed to distilling their surplus rye, barley, wheat, corn, or fermented grain mixtures to make whiskey. They were experts at this. The farmers resisted the tax, and in these regions, whiskey often served as a medium of exchange, a barter element. Many of the resistors were war veterans who believed that they were fighting for the principles of the American Revolution, in particular against taxation without local representation. While the federal government maintained that the taxes were the legal expression of congressional taxation powers, it was a confrontation and a rebellion. Let's skip ahead to Nat Turner's rebellion, and there were a number of slave rebellions. We'll just mention this one in particular. Nat Turner's rebellion, also known as the Southampton Insurrection, was a slave rebellion that took place in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. It was led by Nat Turner. Rebel slaves killed from 55 to 65 people, at least 51 of them being white. The rebellion was put down within a few days, but Turner survived in hiding for more than 2 months afterwards. The rebellion was effectively suppressed at Belmont Plantation in August of 1831. There was widespread fear in the aftermath, and white militias organized in retaliation in opposition to the slaves. The state executed 56 slaves accused of being part of the rebellion, and many non-participant slaves were punished in the frenzy. Approximately 120 slaves and free blacks were murdered by militia and mobs in the area. State legislatures, in reaction, passed new laws prohibiting education of slaves and free black people, restricting rights of assembly and other civil liberties to free black people, and requiring white ministers to be present at all worship services, because there was a suspicion that all of the revolutionary or protest activities were being spread. The murder of Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, from 1802 to 1837, an American Presbyterian minister, journalist, newspaper editor, and an abolitionist. He was shot and killed by a pro-slavery mob in Afton, Illinois, during their attack to destroy Lovejoy's press and abolitionist materials. John Quincy Adams said the murder gave a shock as of an earthquake throughout the country. The Boston Recorder declared that these events called forth from every part of the land a burst of indignation, which has not had its parallel in this country since the Battle of Lexington. John Brown, who will be very important in leading up to the Civil War, said publicly, "Here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." And the Seneca Falls Convention. A group of feminists on July 19, 1848, hosted the first women's rights convention in the United States, the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Around 300 people assembled to protest the government's unequal treatment of women and to call for women to be granted all the rights and freedoms outlined in the Declaration of Independence. The convention gave the women's rights movement the momentum it needed to pursue suffrage. Then there were the Know-Nothings. These were really the American Party, as it was called. It was only around for a couple of years, and when people would ask them about what they were doing, they would say they don't know nothing. And so they became known as the Know-Nothing Party. And they had a variety of riots that took place in 1855 to 57 until they gradually faded, and they became known, they pretty much faded into the then established or beginning Republican Party. The Potawatomi Massacre. The Potawatomi Massacre occurred during the night of May 24th and the morning of May 25th, 1856. In reaction to the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery forces, John Brown and a band of abolitionist settlers, some of them members of the Potawatomi Rifles, killed 5 pro-slavery settlers north of Potawatomi Creek in Franklin County, Kansas, and they did it violently. They split their heads open. This was one of the many violent episodes in Kansas preceding the American Civil War, which came to be known collectively as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas involved conflicts between pro- and anti-slavery settlers over whether Kansas Territory would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry was an effort by abolitionist John Brown in October of 1859 to initiate a slave revolt in southern states by taking U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and some called it a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. Brown's party of 22 was defeated by a company of U.S. Marines. Several of those in the raid would later be involved in the Civil War. Colonel Robert E. Lee was in overall command of the operation to retake the arsenal. Some names that appear here are Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart were part of the troops guarding the arrest of Brown, and John Wilkes Booth was a spectator at his execution. Brown originally asked Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to join him in his raid, but Tubman was prevented by illness and Douglass declined, as he believed Brown's plan would fail, and of course he was correct. The American Civil War, another protest from 61 to 65 between North and South, primarily resulted in the long-standing controversy over slavery. The war broke out in April 1861, when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina shortly after Lincoln became the president. The Loyalists of the Union in the North, which also included some geographically western and southern states, proclaimed support for the Constitution. They faced secessionists and Confederate states in the South who advocated for states' right to uphold slavery. That will lead to 700,000 or 800,000 dying. The New York City draft riot of 1963 were violent disturbances in Manhattan because of white working class discontent with the new laws passed by Congress that year to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War. The riots remain the largest civil and most racially charged urban disturbance in American history. Lincoln diverted regiments of militia and volunteer troops after the Battle of Gettysburg to control the city. Rioters were working-class men, mostly Irish, who feared that black people were competing for their work and resented that wealthier men who could pay $300, which is the equivalent of something over $700,000 today, could pay a commutation fee to hire a substitute and thus were spared from the draft. 1874, the Women's Crusade. The Women's Crusade was a religious, non-alcohol group, member of the group protesting the sale of alcohol through picketing, marching, and public praying outside of saloons in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, and Michigan. The group was the predecessor to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which helped to pave the way for Prohibition a few decades later. Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began July 14th in Martinsburg, West Virginia, after the B&O cut wages for the third time in a year. The strike ended 69 days later and was put down by unofficial militias, a National Guard, and some federal troops. 100 people were killed in the unrest, and the local population feared that the workers were rising in revolution, such as the then well-known Paris Commune of 1871. The workers were not represented by trade unions. They pretty much did not exist yet at that time. The city and state governments, aided by unofficial militias, the National Guard, federal troops, and private militias organized by the railroads, fought against the workers. Disruption was widespread, and at its height, the strikes were supported by about 100,000 workers, a large percentage at that time. With the intervention of federal troops in several locations, most of the strike was gone by. Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot was the aftermath of a bombing that took place at a labor demonstration in May 1886, Haymarket Square in Chicago. Began as a peaceful rally in support of workers striking for 8-hour workday. The day after, police killed one and injured several workers. An unknown person threw a dynamite bomb at the police as they acted to disperse the meeting. The bomb blast and ensuing gunfire resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. A dozen of others were wounded. In the internationally publicized legal proceedings that followed, 8 anarchists were convicted of conspiracy. The evidence was that one of the defendants may have built the bomb, but none of those on trial had thrown it. 7 were sentenced to death and 1 to a term of 15 years in prison. Illinois Governor Oglesby commuted 2 of the sentences to terms of life in prison, and another committed suicide in jail rather than face the gallows. The other 4 were hanged November of 1887. In 1893, Illinois Governor Altgeld pardoned the remaining defendants and criticized the trial. Anarchy. Anarchy is a form of society without rulers. It's primarily advocated by anarchists who propose replacing the state with a stateless society based on voluntary free association. It's an idealist way of looking at our society, or a society. These institutions or free associations are generally modeled to represent concepts such as community and economic self-reliance, interdependence, and individualism. In simple terms, anarchy means without rulers or without authority. As such, under anarchy, there is no coercive rule by a single group or individual, rather instead by an individual upon themselves, and the people then entirely. Modern anarchism was a significant part of the workers' movement alongside Marxism at the end of the 19th century. Modernism, industrialization, reaction to capitalism, and mass migration helped anarchism to flourish and to spread around the globe. Major schools of thought of anarchism sprouted up as anarchism grew as a social movement, particularly anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, and individualist anarchism. As the workers' movement grew, the divide between anarchists and Marxists grew as well. Initially, they were very close to one another, but then they had a drifting apart. 2 currents formally split in the 5th Congress of the First International in 1872, and the events that followed did not heal the gap. Anarchists participated enthusiastically in the Russian Revolution, but as soon as the Bolsheviks established their authority, anarchists were harshly suppressed, most notably in Kronstadt and in the Ukraine. The anthropology of anarchism has changed in the contemporary era as the traditional lines or ideas of the 19th century have been abandoned. Most anarchists are now younger activists informed with feminist and ecological concerns. They're involved in counterculture, black power, creating temporary autonomous zones and events such as the Carnival Against Capital. These movements are not anarchist, but anarchistic. Anarchy assassinations took place throughout the world during these late 19th, early 20th century period. And you see the various ones that are listed here. Anarchism has pretty much faded into the background compared to what it originally was, where there was a lot of assassinations that took place in the world. Homestead strike. The Homestead strike, also known as the Homestead Steel Strike or Homestead Massacre, was an industrial lockout and strike which began July 1, 1892, culminating in a battle between strikers and private security agents on July 6, 1892. The battle was a pivotal event in U.S. labor history. The dispute occurred at the Homestead Steel Works in the Pittsburgh area town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the Carnegie Steel Company. The final result was a major defeat for the Union of Strikers and a setback for their efforts to unionize the steel workers. Then the Pullman strike. The Pullman strike was a nationwide railroad strike in the United States that lasted from May 11th to July 20th, 1894, and a turning point for U.S. labor law. It pitted the American Railway Union against the Pullman Company, the main railroads, and the federal government of the United States under President Cleveland. The strike and boycott shut down much of the nation's freight and passenger traffic west of Detroit, Michigan. Many of the Pullman factory workers joined the American Railway Union, led by later three-time presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, which supported their strike by launching a boycott in which the union members refused to run trains containing Pullman cars. Remember, Pullman was a place just south on the south side of Chicago. Today, it's a largely black part of the city of Chicago, but it was a union town during that. The conflict began in Pullman, Chicago, May 11th, when nearly 4,000 factory employees at the Pullman Company began a wildcat strike in response to recent reductions in wages. 30 workers were killed. Most of the factory workers who built Pullman cars lived in the company town, as it was called then, of Pullman on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. The industrialist George Pullman had designed it ostensibly as a model community, and Pullman had a diverse workforce. He wanted to hire African Americans for certain jobs at the company, and he used ads and other campaigns to help bring workers into his company. Coal strike of 1902, was also known as the anthracite coal strike, was a strike by the United Mine Workers in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania. Miners struck for higher wages, shorter workdays, and the recognition of their union. The strike threatened to shut down the winter fuel supply to major American cities. At that time, residences were typically heated with anthracite or hard coal, which produces higher heat value and less smoke than soft bituminous coal. The strike never resumed as the miners received a 10% wage increase and reduced work days from 10 to 9 hours, and the workers got a higher price for coal and did not recognize the trade union as a bargaining union. It was the first labor dispute in which the U.S. federal government intervened as a neutral arbitrator, and this was the role of Teddy Roosevelt to get involved in it. The Triangle's shirtwaist fire protest. Labor rights activists mounted parades to draw attention to dangerous work conditions and to mourn the victims of a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And it had killed 146 garment workers in New York City, April 5th, 1911. They had been locked in to do their work and could not get out when the fire started. It was a great tragedy. They leaped, many of them, from the windows down to the pavement and died. Legislation was passed a few years later to increase work safety and to allow people to work fewer hours. Women's suffrage. Although the movement for women's suffrage to vote began in the latter half of the 19th century, involving out of women's activism and frustration with the abolition or anti-slavery movement, the first mass demonstrations for suffrage weren't held until 1911. They were organized by suffragist leader Alice Paul, who had been impressed by the tactics of the British suffrage movement while she was traveling in England. A suffrage parade in 1913 on the eve of President Wilson's inauguration was marred by violence, but also increased the integration of the movement. Members of Black sorority Delta Sigma Theta marched as a delegation, while Black journalist and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells marched side by side with the white women from Illinois. In 1916-17, suffragettes picketed the White House, and with one silent picket leading to the arrest of 218 women from 26 states. The women were jailed and force-fed at the Occoquan Workhouse, a prison in Virginia, and their mistreatment led to public outrage and helped with the campaign. The 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote passed Congress in 1919 and was ratified in 1920, only in August, only a couple of months before the actual first election in 1920 that they were able to participate in. And so this is the end for today. We've summarized protests up through World War I. Next, and 2 weeks from now, we'll see the protest has never gone away, but has only changed in form.
And now you could do me a really big favor. If you did enjoy this presentation, it would really help me if you hit the like and subscribe buttons, because that will give me encouragement to produce even more of these special History by Lou presentations just for you.